Okay, so lately there's been a lot of talk about this debt ceiling that is quickly approaching, and how basically our whole national dialogue has been over the debt and deficit. And I thought I'd do a video to show uh, what party, what type of people typically care more about the deficit. And if you answered the Republicans, you have successfully bought into their propaganda, because when you look clearly at history, clearly at the facts, you will see that the last thing you want to do, if your biggest issue is reducing the deficit, is to vote for a Republican. It is the worst possible thing for the deficit, and history proves it. Okay, so over the last 50, 60 years or so, there have been five presidents that have increased our deficit. All of them except one were Republicans. Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. On the Democratic end, or on the decreasing the deficit, there were four presidents that decreased the deficit. Of those four, three were Democrats. They were Clinton, Jimmy Carter, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. The only president to have balanced the budget over the last at least 75 years has been a Democrat. It was Bill Clinton. And the fact that the Republicans are playing a game with our debt ceiling is really seen in the fact that the current leadership, John Boehner, Eric Cantor, Mitch McConnell, Jon Kyl, the four leaders of the Republicans in Congress, have voted 19 times to raise the debt ceiling. But now that Obama is in office, whoa, wait a minute. Wait 1 second. We can't do this. We cannot do this. And they really aren't the exception to the rule. If you look at Republican votes for raising the debt ceiling under George W. Bush, three separate occasions there were over 50 Republicans in the Senate who voted to increase the debt limit. And every time there were at least 25 votes. Even when Republicans were deep in the minority. And then you look at, well, where did this deficit actually come from? The biggest increase in our deficit has come from two presidents, George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan. George W. Bush took us from it was around a $300 billion surplus. It was a little bit less than that. It was like 286, something like that. He took us from a surplus to his final term in office left us with his final budget left us with a $1.4 trillion deficit. So he increased government expenditures by $1.6 trillion. That's how much Bush increased it by. Our current deficit is $1.6 trillion, which means Bush increased the deficit by $1.6 trillion. Obama has increased the deficit by $200 billion. George Bush was 8 times worse. 8 times worse. That is an empirical fact. Reagan increased the deficit by 300%. He tripled it. So much so that George H.W. Bush had to raise taxes and break a campaign pledge because the debt and deficit were rising at such a large rate. And you know how earlier I mentioned Obama has added $200 billion onto our deficits. There's some things in that number that need to be explained. First off, that budget was inherited. It is hard to change a budget. The budget he inherited was $1.4 trillion. It featured $700 billion in mandatory TARP disbursements, better known as the bailout. And included in these inherited conditions were also 2 wars with ballooning costs and a Medicare reform law that was passed under Bush that was coming well above budget, which means they had to revise their numbers upward, which was a Bush program that Obama couldn't touch unless it were repealed. So you can argue that the $200 billion that Obama has even added onto the deficit are really unfair to pin just on him. Then you also have to consider that when he took office, unemployment jumped nearly 4%, and that means the government was taking in less revenue, and it was paying more out in benefits because people were experiencing tough economic times, had to collect unemployment. More people were on Medicaid, things like that. Now, despite all this, conservatives still think Obama is this massive spender. When you look at his record, and this is just patently false. Obama, before his first term is up, will have done more to reduce the debt and deficit than any other president in history. Through the 2011 budget and several executive orders, he trimmed $80 billion off of the federal deficit. He is, with this debt ceiling, his plan was to reduce $4 trillion from our long-term debt over the course of a few years. It may be as low as $2 trillion, but either one of those numbers would make it qualify as the largest debt reduction in history. And not only that, but there are plans to end the Bush tax cuts when they expire in 2012, which means that'll be at least an additional $700 billion that could reach as high as $4.4 trillion, depending on how much of it they repeal. And healthcare reform over 10 years reduces the deficit by $2.1 trillion because it makes many reforms that keep the cost of healthcare down, and reforms to that awful Medicare system that Bush passed, basically. So you add all those up, you've got around $6.5 trillion off of a $14 trillion debt. And you want to tell me that Republicans know better about the debt? They don't give a damn about the debt. If you want real meaningful action on the debt, you should never, ever vote for a Republican. It'll never happen under a Republican. It will always happen under a Democrat. Democrats have to control at least one branch of government for the debt and deficit to be reduced. And that isn't my opinion. That is an empirical, provable fact.